A few nights ago, there was a wholesale event at Square Miles Roastery, and as part of it, we had a bunch of customers there, and I gave a short talk. And that talk was very similar to the one that I'd given in Dublin recently, which a few people had asked about seeing. So I decided I would record it and share it. Now, this event was very friendly, it was very relaxed, and so this talk is reflective of that. It's a little less serious in tone and content than the talks I have given at bigger, more serious events and conferences. I don't think I say anything particularly shocking in there, but it's definitely a lot more relaxed. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoy. Leave me a comment afterwards if there's questions. I'll do my best to answer them. So, how the past predicts the future.
I would argue, and I wouldn't be the first to argue this, that a great deal of what's going to happen can be kind of discerned by what has happened in the past. You know what I mean? We are doomed to repeat our failures as a species, and we've proven that over and over and over again. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we got to here to see where that sort of sends us off as a trajectory for where we go next. Make sense? All right, so I'm going to start a long time ago, to some people, to me, to whoever. 2005. There's a few people maybe who were working in coffee in 2005, a few of us, maybe one, two, a couple of us, you know, yeah, I see you. In the UK, the coffee scene at that time could best be summarized with this. And this is not me throwing shade on someone's coffee machine or whatever. Anyone know this manufacturer? Frappuccino? Do you know why it's called Frappuccino? It's a contraction of Frank's Cappuccino. Genuinely. And this is a company based in Birmingham, and they were building like this style of kind of just like boxy classic espresso machines back then. And in the UK, we didn't really know very much about coffee, to be honest. This was the company that was sponsoring the barista competitions back then. And the competitions were kind of very much about like syrup, chocolate, and like sweet things, and a bit of bartending flair, and that's kind of where we were. And the coffee scene was not hugely advanced. There were a few people trying, but really, we were not making good coffee even, you know, at the top end of things. It was not particularly advanced. And I started working for a different machine company then, and my job was a training manager, and I would travel around the UK, and I would work with businesses and work with coffee suppliers. Note the language there, coffee suppliers, on education and training. Because at that time, no one roasted their own coffee, right? I would say that there were loads of little coffee companies all over the UK. Loads and loads of them. And most of them bought their coffee from Master Roast in Lincoln and York, right? These were companies that were doing probably in the region of about 4,000 tons each of kind of private label coffee. That's a lot, just for context. And you would go, and they would have these kind of computers full of people's preferred blends that were all basically the same with different packaging. And you went and you said, I want coffee that I can sell for like £9 a kilo. And they'd be like, yeah, all right. And then you'd get a bag of coffee or a pallet of coffee at the end of it. And at that time, there were a couple of little sort of startup-y things, has been. James Gourmet Coffee over in Ross-on-Wye. These were these kind of little weird anomalies in the UK market. These were people who roasted their own coffee, and that was just weird. Now, I promise it was weird. Downstairs, we have two roasting machines. We've got a little 15 kilo in red, and then there's the other one, the bath. If you go downstairs, you'll see it. That used to belong to Master Roast, actually, and it was bought by a customer of theirs in Milton Keynes. And after 2 years, he was like, this roasting business is a bit tricky. Can you just roast my coffee again, and I'll put the roaster on eBay? Which worked out for us. So back then, we you know, in sort of, actually a little bit later, but around then we bought that roaster on eBay for a disgustingly small amount of money, but it was in a disgusting state back then. Not a lot of love for coffee as it was then. But this was really the market, you know what I mean? Like there were loads and loads of coffee companies all over the UK basically selling the same thing, which was kind of fascinating and weird. And in the UK, we thought that everything special came from outside, and the Scandinavians were really where it was at. This will make me feel old. How many people can tell me who that is? He was so famous to me. He was the world barista champion in 2005. He's a guy called Troels Poulsen. He's from Copenhagen. Still in Copenhagen. Contra Coffee if you go there. He's wearing the t-shirt. And at this point, the Danes just kept winning the barista champs. You know what I mean? Like Fritz Storm had won it before. Martin Hildebrandt had won it before. He was Danish too. The year after him, Klaus Thompson won it. It was just this. It was getting boring. And the nice thing was that it got so boring that the Danish weren't even interested. In 2008, 6 people competed in the Danish Barista Championship because, you know, yeah, we've got champions. Who cares? There's no mystery about what would happen if you win because there were just 4 or 5 Danish people walking around Copenhagen, not a big city, who were world Barista champions. So, rolling around 2006, and that's a year that stuff starts to happen in the UK, right? Little seeds of things starts to happen. And I guess I would say that the competition vaguely begins to professionalize. It still looks very different to how it does now. But this one company that I worked for, there was a very smart guy that started it, decided that it was worth trying to do something in good coffee, that was trying to grow a coffee culture. And he was way before his time. We tried to start a barista guild in 2006. Nobody came because there was no one to turn up. And personally, for me, that was kind of a big year because I got involved in competitions and I won the UK that year. And I don't know why I put these photos up, but that, God, it's the pink shirt, right? It's so this was, huh? It's me. It's me. Just a very young, less grey version of me. So this wasn't just about me, you know, going to compete in the Worlds, but it was really about what turned out to be quite important was me and Annette, the co-founder here, kind of getting more immersed in like a global community. Because at that time, I'd started in coffee in 2003, and I felt very lonely. So I had coffee friends on the internet, and not really in London, and that stayed that way for a long time. But getting involved in the competitions, you realize that there's this big kind of global community out there, all these different cultures who were way, way further down the line of good coffee than the UK was at that time, right? Which was quite inspiring, quite useful, but also quite distant. So it brings us around to sort of 2007. And in London at that time, there were 2 really interesting coffee businesses in particular that I want to talk about. One, I hope is familiar to like a couple of people here. Anyone? Flat White, Soho? This guy? Cam McClure? Lovely guy. Flat White was this interesting anomaly to me, along with the other business that'll come next, which I may as well bring up, which is Monmouth, actually. So Flat White and Monmouth, right? They're both very successful in 2007, and they're very successful doing quite different things. Flat White is successful doing espresso in this whole new way, where the game was put as much coffee as is possible into the basket, and then get as little liquid out as possible on the other side. And if you want to be weird and nerdy about it, like when we started weighing espresso, I went in and pulled shots with Cam, 28 grams into the basket, right? Genuinely astonishing, and about 20 out. Which was, you know, intense as an experience, a little kind of salty and whatever, but it looked good to pour milk into. And they were smashing out drinks, they were having fun, they were super busy. They were doing like 110, 120 kilos a week out of that at kind of peak times. And they were doing this thing that was quite new. And then you had Monmouth, right? Started in 1978, but in 2007, they're really kind of, they're cranking as well. Borough Market is hugely busy. And the thing that they're doing that sort of bothers me still, not that it was a bad thing, it was that they were doing filter coffee, right? They were doing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of filter coffee. Hundreds of cups brewed to order of filter coffee. And for years and years afterwards, everyone was like, nah, I don't want to do filter coffee. No one buys it. And you're like, but they do hundreds a day. And I was like, yeah, but no. And they were just outliers. And the thing that's interesting for me was clearly there was this demand for coffee. And if you did something good and interesting, people really, really responded to that. But it wasn't doing the thing that maybe we've seen more recently where people are like, oh, coffee, there's money in that, I'll just have a go at coffee, right? People looked at this and were like, oh, that looks hard. Maybe I'm not going to do it, I don't know. But there was all this success, but none of the magnetism for some reason. People weren't desperate to get into it the way that we saw in the years that came later, and that kind of weirded me out. For me, that was also a year where we actually traveled around the US to try and sort of see things. Anyone recognize this guy? Anyone recognize this guy? It's a little hero moment for me. It's kind of a hard one. His name is David Schomer. He's fascinating. The coffee at his shops tastes like it did 10 years ago because that's how he likes it. And actually, that's immensely impressive. And the other thing that bothers me slightly is that he still pulls better shots than all of his staff. I swear, they just like a little bit better every time. And his staff are rigorously drilled. You work a year as a barback before you get to touch a coffee machine. So the fact that he let me steam milk was mostly down to the fact that we had a TV crew. For us, it felt like specialty was kind of booming around the world. Like San Francisco was a big thing, Portland was a big thing, Vancouver had like a massive scene, Seattle still doing its thing. It felt like coffee was gaining momentum everywhere, which seemed like a good thing for us starting Square Mile a decade ago in a railway arch, which some of you I know are familiar with or visited us there. And I think that one of the lessons we learned back then was the value of community, right? The people that used to come to these weird events that we did, that I'm very proud of. I know some of you in this room that came to this event, and probably this event if you're not in this photo. There's a few people that you might recognize if you work in coffee too long. Community turned out to be this really powerful and interesting thing in London. The early kind of coffee community here was a very coherent, very together coffee community, right? I'm looking at Giddy Up and Dose in the back and kind of being like, a great example of those businesses, right? Because for a long time, the news now is depressing, broadly speaking, but growing up, the way that the news worked on TV was they would do big headline news, depressing, boring, and just before the summary, they would be like, and here's the crazy weird person we found this week, right? And they would pan over to some guy in a potting shed in the middle of England, and he'd be talking about breeding rabbits, and we'd be like, what a crazy freak. And then we'd hear the news again, and we'd finished sad. And what I worried about was that people who are extremely passionate about quality tend to sound crazy, right? Especially in a market that has no quality. So if you're there going, no, coffee is all terrible, and in fact, can be amazing and can be interesting and can be sweet and can be complex. If you're just one person, you're a crazy person. But if you have a community of people all saying the same thing, this becomes a whole other thing. And what's interesting is the media treats you really differently to being a crazy person. You become a trend worth talking about, worth writing about. And back in this time, Time Out were actually the magazine that were kind of influential and interested, and if they wrote about your coffee shop, you were busier next week, for sure. That doesn't really happen anymore, but definitely happened back then. And it was the beginning, I think, of something really interesting for London. So 2009, as we tick along. And tell me if I'm right on this one. Is that the right year? Was it 2009, Jimmy? I got you on here? Yeah. It was 2009? All right, good. A few businesses started in 2009. This is where I get into tricky water right now. I'm gonna ruffle some feathers probably. Mostly because the next slide looks really weird. A bunch of businesses started that became quite iconic for the London coffee scene. There's more on here, there's more than are on here. But I think it began to spread what would turn out to be quite a difficult idea. And I don't know why it looks like this. I can type, I promise. The idea that if you have great quality, then you will be successful, right? This was an idea that really began to gain traction around this time. And in tiny letters down here, it says myth. because I don't think that's true. I don't think the simple statement of quality equals success is true or correct. I think advantage equals success, right? And at that time, quality was an advantage, no question, right? There was not a lot of good coffee, and having great coffee gave you an advantage in the marketplace. It really did. People would travel, and you know what I mean? Like you could leverage your advantage to be successful at that time. But I think it sort of told a story that was probably further compounded by coffee roasters that good quality coffee equals success. And I think did disservice to the rest of the hard work that goes into success. That's about more than just serving a nice cup of coffee. And I think it's something that's become even more true now, where good quality coffee is not particularly hard to find. Sure, some parts of the UK, sure, some parts of London, not as easy as others, but certainly there are bits of London where it's very easy to find good coffee. And just because you have good doesn't mean success. It's the kind of Red Queen theory of evolution, right, which is a book. I can't remember by who. And simply summarized as, we talk about survival of the fittest, right? Let's say you have a bunch of animals, the ones that can run faster don't get eaten, right? Typical example. All you have left are fast animals, right? Once the slow ones are gone, no one has an advantage anymore. And that's true in business with everything. And what we would turn to our advantage would very quickly be co-opted by others. From that year, Starbucks announced the flat white. Do you know what I mean? They are like, ooh, that's a thing people buy. We should do that. This was done by a really nice guy called Darcy, who was the MD of Starbucks UK. And he was so nice, they fired him. Because he did things like closed stores where people didn't want a Starbucks and sort of listened to local communities and sort of tried to be sympathetic in how they opened places. And I think the US head office were like, that's losing, and you will go, and we will put someone new in who just was like, we're going to open more stores everywhere. And they did, and it worked fine. But this was 2009, I think the date's missing off here. Costa did the same thing with their weird, like 13-ounce flat white or something, I don't even know, it made no sense. You've seen the new Costa flat menu, right? Have you seen this?
Yes. Everything is just flat.
Everything is flat, and it's part of the flat family. Who lets them say this out loud? You can get a flat mocha, a flat black. You can, I'm not even, that's not a joke. Anyway, it was strange times in 2009. So 2010. I hate myself for this next sentence. Capitalism sort of likes a certain state of order, a certain state of being, and it does not abide by deviation from that state. What it will do as a system is drag everything back to some kind of capitalistic order. I will explain, I promise you that. And I'd say in some ways 2010 was a year of kind of peak rebellion, of coffee trying to get as far away from what it was as it possibly could, right? Pushing as far as we could into weird, into new. And I would define that by how we made a bunch of really interesting, helpful mistakes, which we didn't know were mistakes at the time. But hindsight is a powerful and cruel thing. We here did a thing called Penny University, which was like this temporary cafe that had 6-ish seats, no espresso drinks, just filter coffee, 3 different filter coffees, no milk, no sugar. That was it. Everything was brewed to order in front of you. What we were trying to do at the time was try and make filter coffee expensive and valuable, because filter coffee still had that kind of greasy hangover of being a thing that was given away at hotel conferences, that was just a pot of dark filth that was caffeinated and necessary. And like Pret do this thing that still just irks me. Pret sell filter coffee and they sell espresso, and they use the same coffee blend for both, because who cares? And an espresso at Pret, certainly was the last time I checked, and I haven't been for a while, £1.25, bargain. So that's for 1 ounce of liquid. Or filter coffee, 99p. Because espresso is special, it's magic. It's luxury. I don't know, but like this myth that espresso was somehow better and filter coffee was somehow worse was really a thing and a problem. And so we did a thing where we're like, well, let's just sort of celebrate filter coffee a little bit. And what we learned in about 3 months and probably didn't communicate was pouring water on coffee is slow and annoying and painful hard work without a huge amount of reward to it. You know what I mean? It takes a long time to make a pour over. But pour overs kind of boomed around this time. And it wasn't just in the UK that we were doing weird things. Anyone recognize this cafe? A couple of people recognize this cafe? This is Intelligentsia's cafe in Venice Beach. This was kind of peak madness in a way. So this cafe has 5 espresso machines in it. This is how far we got down the path of crazy. So you come in, easy. You come in here and you line up to a central point. And at that point you are collected and taken and hosted by a barista who takes you to one of the 4 two-group machines around the cafe for like a personal interactive experience, right? Which, you know, that's like 4 cafes all in one. They had like a custom old La Marzocco redone with some strangeness inside it, and a slow bar for tea and that kind of stuff. So like 5 little mini cafes. And then here, what you can't see is like stadium style seating, like bench seating. So you could sort of sit and watch the spectacle of this thing. It got a bit weird. And this also coincidentally, same year that pressure profiling became a thing, right? It's the same thing. We're like, we just must explore and do new stuff and experiment because we're just going to find the promised land of deliciousness and we'll just unlock something that when we serve it to a customer, like a light bulb going on in their head, they'll get it, right? They'll get that coffee's amazing. If I can just find how to brew this espresso or serve them this drink or give them that experience, they'll get it. And that's not really how people work, that's not how people drink their coffee, but we were full of a great deal of hope and enthusiasm. And I think when that didn't pan out the way that we wanted it to, it led in some ways to this, a kind of period of stagnation. And if you've worked in coffee in London for more than 5 years, and you think there hasn't been some stagnation, let me know. Anyone? Maybe you just haven't worked in coffee for 5 years, I don't know. The ideas have sort of slowed down. And this is the bit where capitalism's grubby little fingers stick into you and start to pull you back to the mainstream, like what it was before. So, if that's what's going to happen, well, the question is, what can we learn, right? What can we learn from where we've gone? If we plot that point out, we sort of deviated out from the normal, we got weirder and weirder and weirder, and then we stopped. We are going to get, to some extent, pulled back in again. And we know this because, forgive the clip art, everything is cyclical, right? There is loads of different cycles you could talk about. You could talk about the hype cycle. That's kind of an interesting one if you want to Google it. There's the straight innovation cycle, right? You have a boring industry. So passionate people do some interesting stuff. They gain some success. Some of them become quite successful and begin to acquire other companies to maintain their growth. They consolidate, and you end up with not many companies and quite a boring industry again. Beer in the UK has done this before, right? In the 70s and 80s, loads of breweries. And then 90s, 2000s, 5 breweries kind of own everybody, right? The industry massively consolidates. All these little startup breweries get absorbed by the giant evil breweries. And what that led to was the craft beer movement here in London. What happened again? People are restless and annoyed and they want better and they start doing interesting stuff and they grow and they grow and they grow and some get a bit more successful. And then lo and behold, was it AB InBev come and be like, Camden, I'll have you and this and you. And the acquisitions have started with great speed in beer and increasing speed in coffee, right? We're starting to see it very clearly at a much, much larger level. You've got like JAB, are we familiar with JAB? This kind of weird private equity thing out of, where are they from? Austria? No. Where's JAB from? Someone tell me. Anyone? No one. Bueller? No. So there are things that have happened before that we can expect to happen again. Coming back to coffee, this one's going to be interesting in a funny sort of way. Toll roasting, white label roasting, we're going to start to see more and more coffee companies that don't roast coffee anymore. It seems kind of weird, but right now there are so many roasters in the market that roasting your own coffee is no longer an advantage. You know what I mean? Actually, in a very aggressive marketplace, if you could go cheaper and still make money, that's an advantage. Now, I'm not interested in this, but lots of people are. And the easiest way to get cheap coffee is to have a very big company roast it for you with all of their scale, put your brand and logo on a bag, and you can turn around to Cafe X and be like, hey, buy my coffee, it's whatever it is, but it's cheap. It's none of this overpriced local crap. This is just good, honest, value for money. And that's going to be a thing. I'm not saying we're going to start. We're not going to white label roast for people. I should be clear about this. I have no interest in doing this. We have no interest in doing this for other people. We'd be a terrible business to do that. But this is coming back. No questions about it. And you'd be surprised by the number of roasters already doing it as they look to grow just through volume and as they desperately can. This is inevitable. We can be sad about it. We can be sad that big companies are going to buy little companies, bigger companies are going to buy big companies, and giant companies are going to buy big-ish companies. It's going to happen. We can't stop it. You know, capitalism demands growth, right? Your capital, you must leverage it to decrease your costs and make more money. It's going to happen. I don't like it. None of us really like it. It makes the whole situation boring, but actually, that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world if we're trying to be interesting. So, kind of brings us to the question, what if we want a different future, right? If we don't want to go back into exactly the same loop, how do we splinter off and spin off to the side away from where everything's going to go? Well, I would argue that we're going to have a little bit of patience. Right now, it's really, really hard to stand out as a high-quality coffee place in London because there are loads of high-quality coffee places in London. That's not going to be the case in a few years' time. There will just be less. Some will have consolidated. Some will have sold themselves to Costa. Costa are going to buy somebody, I have no doubt, I suspect. I know who they want, and there are companies trying to be bought by Costa right now. But yeah, that's a definite exit for somebody out there. But if we don't want to do that, if we continue to plow the path that we want to plow, then we can be like some of the beer companies in the US that started in the 70s, right? That have been through this cycle once and have grown and have persevered by continuing to go the way they set out to go in the first place. Because the temptation is always going to be now, well, how do I compete? Maybe I cut costs. Maybe I go cheaper. Maybe I go more mainstream, right? Which is going to be an increasingly crowded and difficult place. And I think staying true to what genuinely inspired us in the first place, that will keep us deviant from capitalism, I think is the way to go. We have to have a really strong idea of what we're trying to achieve. We have to have strong vision. We have to get people behind it. But it's about not caving to the increasing pressure, I think. I'm not saying that we should try and run bad businesses or ignore our costs or ignore rising rents or ignore rising people costs and all of the challenges that we face. But we've got to choose where we're going to compromise. And if we compromise in our quality, and in our brand, and our vision, then we become stuck in the mass of competition. We don't stand out anymore and we have no advantage if we go like everyone else is going. So it's really, as far as I'm concerned, about remaining different to everyone else and accepting what's going to happen in the marketplace. You can try and fight it or you can try and take advantage of it. You know? And I would rather surf the wave than drown under it, which is how I see it. It's going to happen. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'll say thank you, and if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you.